We're now in public session and we propose to consider some of the public petitions. The first petition for consideration is P1918 from Miss Angela Dunn. We are proposing that we will forward a copy of the response from the Department of Education and Skills to the petitioner and close the petition. Is that agreed? Agreed. The next petition for consideration is petition 3318 from Mr. Daniel Ryan in relation to the issue of freedom of speech. It is proposed that we forward a copy of the response from the Department of Justice and Equality and close the petition. Is that agreed? Agreed, thank you. And the final petition for consideration is petition 3718 from Mr. Leighton, and it is proposed that we deem the petition inadmissible in accordance with Standing Orders 11C 1A. Is that agreed? That's agreed, okay. So I don't propose that we suspend the meeting now to welcome the witnesses. The witnesses are taking their seat here, and you'll remember that at a previous meeting we considered the issue of orchestra services in RT on foot of a petition, and to help us further consider this matter, I'm pleased to welcome from RT, Mr. Heydon O'Doul, head of RT Lyric FM and RT Orchestras, and I hope I've pronounced the name correctly there, Gamelin Scale, if I haven't, and Mr. Rory Coveney, Special Advisor to the Director General of RT, and Mr. Matthew Horsman, Mediatique, co-author of the recent review of its orchestral services. So I wish to advise our witnesses to turn off their mobile phones as they interfere with the sound system and will interfere with the broadcasting of the meeting. Before I ask you to address the meeting, I wish to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 172L of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. I also wish to advise you that the opening statement and any other documents you have submitted to the committee may be published on the committee website after the meeting, and members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the House, houses or any official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. So to commence the discussion, I now invite RT to make its presentation. I propose that we take no more than 10 minutes in total, and I think what we could have then after that is kind of a to and fro, a Q&A if you will, an interactive discussion in an informal basis, in a relaxed way if you will, and so I'd like to now invite Heydon to make his presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Committee members, thank you for inviting us here today and to the Petitions Committee to discuss the public petition concerning the future of RT's orchestras. I am joined by my RT colleague Rory Coveney and by Matthew Horsman from Mediatique, who completed the review RT Orchestras Ensuring a Sustainable Future, along with Helen Bowden. The petition to the Minister for Culture, Heritage and the Gaeltacht, Joseph Madigan, came on foot of an announcement by RTE that it would conduct an independent review of its orchestral provision. The fact that the petition garnered such support and that it has been presented for the formal consideration of the Oireachtas is testimony to the importance of this issue. RTE would concur with that position, and we welcome the opportunity to discuss the findings of that review and with the members here today. As members will be aware, this review was conducted against very challenging financial circumstances facing the organisation. These circumstances persist. Members may have seen that just last week the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland, RT's regulator, having completed a statutory 5-year review of both RTE and TG4, it recommends at a minimum that RTE should receive an increase in its annual public funding of 30 million per annum. Given the urgency of RT's current funding position, the increased level of public funding recommended should be available to the broadcaster immediately. In presenting its recommendations, the BAI has taken account of the fact that, notwithstanding its frequent funding recommendations to government in the case of RTE, there has been no television licence fee increase in over 10 years. RTE has seen its total income decrease by 100 million, 24% between 2008 and 2016. Since 2016, commercial growth has been very modest and the TV licence fee system remains unreformed. As Matthew from Mediatheek will explain shortly, orchestral music in other countries is typically supported by a variety of public funding mechanisms and grants at national, regional and local government level. In Ireland, by contrast, full-time orchestral music is dependent on just one public funding source, the TV licence fee. While RTE orchestras have been relatively protected, their budget has declined by 11% in that period, much less than other areas of RTE's output. We now have significant vacancies in our orchestras and have had to sharply reduce commitments to touring and educational activity. Morale within the orchestras has suffered, as indeed has the overall public value of our orchestral provision. As the review was triggered, we were looking at more cuts to budgets, and we were finding it difficult to see how we could accommodate even the current level of provision. There was no possibility of an increase in budgets that would be required for the orchestras to return to full strength and undertake touring and education programmes. Put simply, RTE commissioned the Bowden Review because it was clear to us that as far as the RTE orchestras were concerned, the status quo could not continue. Albeit that perhaps there were some erroneous assumptions made that this review was intended to reduce orchestral provision, there was a wholly correct observation in this statement. The implications of these cuts are shocking, especially given that arts and music education in Ireland is already severely underfunded, and one of the worst systems in the whole of Europe. Something needs to be done to preserve and develop these orchestral institutions. It was written in the spirit of exploring viable solutions to address the situation that RTE commissioned the review. RTE is very aware of the importance of our orchestras within the wider cultural life of the nation and the role we have played in this for the past 70 years. The issues raised, as is evident in the online petition and in the Mediatheek Bowden Review, affect not just RTE but Ireland as a whole. The review carried out in-depth analysis of the options facing us, ranging from outright closure to merger to retention with full funding restored. Critically, the review concluded that neither of the two orchestras should be closed. In fact, they suggested both orchestras should be brought back to full strength. It became clear that to the reviewers, authors, as they consulted widely, that there is widespread support for the retention of both orchestras across the orchestra sector, among all political parties and within government. But because of the review, there is also now the wider understanding of and recognition of the challenges facing RTE, with much more constrained financial resources. The review outcome and key recommendations are consistent with the analysis of previous reviews, such as the Piano Report. It recommended that the National Symphony Orchestra be either established as a cultural institution in its own right or moved to become part of the National Concert Hall. A key provision of the review is that it promotes RTE's role as a key orchestral media partner through ongoing stewardship of the concert orchestra and close affiliation with the National Symphony Orchestra in the future. It recognises the balance between RTE's financial constraints and its public service role in promoting music, arts and culture. Flexibility will be required from orchestra members, but the recommended approach provides a sustainable means of restoring the orchestras to former strength and the basis for a new creative vision. RTE was acutely conscious that any decision that followed the review were not for it alone to make. The overall funding and government's arrangements for orchestral provision in Ireland are as much a matter for public policy as they are considerations for RTE. The support of government, therefore, will be essential if orchestral music in Ireland is to flourish and if the recommendations of the review are to be implemented. In July, the Cabinet considered the review and its recommendations. We included the statement issued by both Ministers Madigan and Naughton in the materials we've already sent to you. You will see that the Government have decided that the National Symphony Orchestra is to come within the remit of the National Concert Hall. In addition, the Government authorised the initiation of discussions on the implementation of the recommendations of the review. Those discussions are to be led by the Department of Culture, Heritage and the Gaeltacht through both an oversight and working group and the relevant stakeholders, RTE and the NCH, and with the appropriate wider constitution and consultation. There has been initial contact between the various stakeholders and the terms of reference for groups is now being finalised. We hope to begin the formal discussions shortly. That is where things stand today. We thought it would be useful for the committee in considering the petition and the related issues that it has raised to hear from the authors of the Bowden Mediatique Review about their findings and their analysis. Unfortunately, Helen Bowden couldn't be here today, but Matthew Horsman from Mediatique is here to give us a very brief overview of the outcomes of the review. Thracian will take questions if you so have any.
Thank you very much, Heydon. So what I propose members to do is to maybe hear from Matthew, and I'm dispensing with the formalities here, so forgive me if I'm referring to you by your first names. It's just the way we operate this committee, and it's just a lot easier. So Matthew, do you want to add to that and give us an overview?
I think there's quite a lengthy presentation that we submitted to the committee before, and I hope that was useful for those who had a chance to look at it. And it's got quite a bit of data which is in here. So perhaps just a couple of observations and then straight to questions. Does that make sense? We were asked to do this report, Helen Bowden and my company Mediatique, back in November. So we spent several months talking across the market, talking to a lot of different people in orchestral music, classical music, and most of, if not all, of the stakeholders that had some skin in this particular game, the future of orchestral music in Ireland. And we were aware as we started the process and went through that the review was coming at a time of financial challenge for public service broadcasting. And RTE continued throughout this period and for some time before, facing pressures on the funding through the licence fee and commercial revenue weakness as well, exacerbated by the structural challenges that media companies are facing, the new entrant challenges of the likes of Amazon, Facebook, Apple, the old fangs that people talk about. So we did also, when we set about doing this work, understood two other pretty important contextual issues. One, that there are appreciably no other countries or markets in the world where orchestral music is not publicly funded, that there is no commercial funding model for orchestral music. There's always a public funding element. But we were also very aware as we went through the international benchmarking that Ireland was very, very different from a lot of markets in that it only had one form of public funding, which was the licence fee, and that the only full-time professional orchestras in Ireland were both operated by RTE. So those were the sort of the background for the report. The question we were asked to answer was not whether one should shut orchestras or merge. That was not the question. The question was, how do you sustain the provision of orchestral music in Ireland? And that was the question we set out to answer. We did extensive international benchmarking. I won't go through the detail. It's in the pack. We looked at a number of sources of evidence, the stakeholder interviews, the survey data, asking people what they thought, and there was a widespread support for orchestral music, even among those who don't necessarily consume it, and the people who also believe that it should be an element of public funding. So there was a good measure of support in the survey. And we also did a lot of financial modelling and checking across the market for market sizing and the context for all of this. While we were completing the recommendations, which I'll finish on, RTE was, it was very clear to us that the RTE's challenge was huge. Between 2008 and 2016, the last year for which we had data at the time of the report, saw its income decrease by 24%. Orchestras were actually quite protected in that period, down by 11%, so less than the overall hit that RTE took. But it was pretty clear from looking at the situation that it was very difficult to see how RTE would continue to fund the current level of provision, given the demands on the license fee and on commercial revenue, let alone increase back to an historical level of touring, of education that the orchestras had traditionally done, and which we thought was very important in terms of the overall situation of orchestral music in Ireland. So we concluded that the importance of those orchestras within Ireland were so important indeed that they were more important than RTE. And even though our job was to answer it as a question put to us by RTE, our answer became more complicated because RTE did not have within it the full answer. And that answer, we felt, should be, therefore, a statement that both orchestras should be safeguarded, that they should be brought back up to their traditional strength, they should again tour, they should again do educational programs, but that only the concert orchestra should remain within the control and direct operation of RTE as a traditional public service orchestra, and that the National Symphony Orchestra, living up to its name, would be a true National Symphony Orchestra, either as a cultural institution in its own right, or through the evolving status of the National Concert Hall through its upgrading and facilities, and which was a natural partner. We didn't come down strongly on one or the other. That was something for really the players and stakeholders to decide, but we felt something that would give the NSO an independence from RTE would safeguard its future. We thought, too, that that would give both orchestras a chance to have a renewed creative vision, and to work together, by the way. The one thing I will underline, and perhaps my last comment here, is that we did underline that we had some suggested funding outcomes, but again, that is for the stakeholders to decide, but we suggested that there needs to be an ongoing contribution from RTE, even to the NSO, the National Symphony Orchestra, in the form of what we call the broadcasting fee, because it was important that RTE continue to support the orchestra. But that there would be a shortfall if we were to get the kind of outcome we wanted, and we think is desirable in Ireland of return to historical levels. There would be a shortfall that the government would be asked to step in to meet. So our recommendation was, in fact, that occur, and I was pleased to see, really around the time of the report's publication, that the government agreed that these were interesting recommendations and worth taking on board.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. Deputy Cassells, you signalled.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and I want to welcome the three witnesses here today and for the presentations that have been made and the discussion that we're having here today on the National Symphony Orchestra and the RTE Concert Orchestra as well. Both orchestras are something that I value greatly, and perhaps it's often forgotten that the RTE Orchestra has a presence beyond Donnybrook and the National Concert Hall. And I know last year I was delighted to welcome the RTE Concert Orchestra to my own hometown of Navan, where, as part of their programme, they played a gala concert to mark the 10th anniversary of our own art centre, Solstice, and along with our own native son, Brian Byrne from Navan, conducting at the helm that night as well. And it was something that was valued greatly by our patrons and indeed the people of our county as well. But for that 2 hours of entertainment, Chairman, comes days and weeks of practice for people to enjoy that moment of pleasure on that Friday night. And so, in this week of the budget, here is the rub, ultimately, in terms of funding and the discussions we're having to sustain what is a valued cultural contribution to our country. And I know the issues that Heydon has raised here today surrounding income, and when I looked at the report and the €100 million drop in commercial revenue or total revenue over the past 10 years is something that I have pressed at the Public Accounts Committee when we have discussed this, and the need for an honest appraisal from all bodies to say, let's stop dodging the bullet and actually deal with the funding issue for our national broadcaster and all the other activities that that entails. Because if we don't, it's the result of conversations here today where there was an overhanging threat implicit in the background to the future of our concert orchestra. And I think the challenges that other platforms, as Matthew has said, are posing to commercial income because of where commercial partners are now going as opposed to traditional areas has to be taken into consideration when funding is being decided for RTE and all that it provides. On the actual review itself, I want to firstly welcome how the review, as Heydon has said, has brought a spotlight onto these issues and maybe shown that there was greater public awareness there than people anticipated. And I think the statistics that were produced are very interesting in terms of those who have actually attended an RTE concert orchestra at 35%, and people who have attended more than once. I think that's a very encouraging statistic. The listenership for orchestras on Oireachtas FM at 16% every month. I think there's strong percentages there. What is a very niche market, but it shows a greater public awareness there than perhaps many people thought. And I think that is interesting to have that debate, because that underscores, and the value of having a review, because it underscores the commitment in keeping funding. Just in addressing how you sustain, because obviously we can get past this impasse, services are retained, but how you make sure you don't come back to this again, and that in fact it grows, and that there isn't this threat of perhaps a part-time orchestra and so forth. Heydon, you talked about the flexibility that will be required from orchestra members, and perhaps maybe you might just elaborate on that somewhat. And you went on to elaborate in terms of the synergy now, the work that the National Symphony Orchestra coming within the remit of the National Concert Hall. Can I just ask how all of that has panned out, how that is coming together, and some of those challenges that you're facing? But to once again to welcome you, to thank you for the work that's being done, and that certainly I will be advocating for the funding that is necessary to make sure that we protect and we grow what is a valued part of our culture.
What I propose to do is maybe just take that answer first before coming to Dara, if that's okay. Yeah, okay, and Jerry then following that. So who wants to take that? Heydon?
Thank you, Deputy. Yes, I mean, the future provision of orchestral music in Ireland is so much in everybody's hands here at the moment. And how we actually are able to go to Navan in the future, how we're able to go to Cork, how we're able to go to Limerick, it's all dependent on the future funding. The funding that we don't currently have, and that doesn't allow us to get outside the pale at the moment. That's our big ambition for both orchestras. And you know, I have a daughter who has a music school down in Macroom in Cork. She's teaching 150 pupils. Those kids need to be able to see and need to be able to be part of the future of orchestral provision in Ireland. And my own background is in music. The orchestras are 70 years old. I've been, I have to say, part of those 70 years for at least 40 years, which doesn't go well for my future with the orchestras within or without of RTE. But the orchestral music, by its nature, and you know, to be able, as well as to be able to bring the big repertoire like the Beethovens and the Mozarts and the Bachs of this world to people, we also have to be able to encourage our own indigenous musicians, composers, conductors, and without the funding we can't do that. You know, we've heard of people like Seán or Bill Whelan or Sean Davey. You may not know the names, but you'll know the pieces. You'll know Misha Era, you'll know Riverdance, you'll know the Brendan Voyage. All the pieces that have come through our orchestras over the last 70 years, all the pieces that have gone on to international acclaim over the years, have all come through our orchestras. The musicians, the composers, the conductors. And that's what we need to protect for the future, and that's what we're trying to do here with this report and the outcomes of the report.
Rory.
I'll just briefly add to that. First of all, just to thank the Deputy for his support in another committee in relation to our overall funding position. A lot of those issues have been well rehearsed in the last year, particularly at various committees here. I know the Director General and a number of others are in front of the Communications Committee next week to talk about some of the more pressing issues around our ongoing difficulties in relation to deficits and financial sustainability. So thank you. And first instance, I mean, I think what Heydon has said, and I think somewhat passionately, he's lived this for many years. This is about trying to protect something and sustain something. The review, or the petition rather, rightly says that something really needs to be done. We're at an impasse or a crossroads for you know, not just RT more broadly, but specifically the challenge around sustaining two orchestras. And what the review is attempted to do is to create a roadmap for a sustainable future. Now, what happens next, I mean, is important. And as we said, as Heydon said in his opening statement, these aren't decisions just for us to make. We've been heartened by the reaction of government. It was swift to support the findings of the review, all of them, because it has implications both financial and in terms of governance for other people and other than just us. They then moved on quickly, and the Cabinet considered the review in total and the recommendations therein in July. And they made an important decision, which was around the ultimate home of the NSO. There was two options, as Matthew referred to, in the review, and the government came down on the side of joining the National Concert Hall and the National Symphony Orchestra in one cultural institution into the future. That has challenges, of course it does. There's logic to it. It is the current physical home of the NSO, but there's no doubt that there is significant challenges for the hall to absorb in a very big new responsibility, which is to run the National Symphony Orchestra, not least the number of people in it. It's growing its headcount very significantly, tripling, in fact. And then there's associated governance arrangements around that in relation to the legislation that underpins the National Concert Hall. Some of those may need to be adjusted. The board structure of the hall itself may need to reflect the new responsibilities. And then ultimately, as the review recommended, there's this new funding mechanism which would requires a grant of some kind to be delivered most likely through the through the Department of Culture. A continued funding relationship between RTE and the NSO, and obviously commercial income that's generated from their performances as well. So all of that is to be worked out along with the actual physical transition in terms of employment rights and everything else over the next year or so between RTE and the National Concert Hall, and all that process is being managed and has been mandated by Cabinet to be managed by the Department of Culture. They're chairing the respective working groups to get this done in a way that works for everyone. So, as I said, so far so good. And this has been I should say from the outset, this has been very difficult for the musicians. They've had their future sort of dangled in front of them. The uncertainty has around their future has been around for some time in RTE, and the review made everyone, I think, somewhat nervous, understandably. But I think there now there is a plan, and there appears to be support for that plan, and we're just hopeful we can deliver it. All the stakeholders can deliver it in the next, as I said, however long it takes, but as soon as we can. So.
Thank you. Dara.
Thanks very much, Sherlock, and I also would like to welcome you all here this afternoon. I think it's the timing is pertinent. It has been a very difficult number of years across so many parts of the state, and yet yesterday to hear the Minister saying that the state balance its books should mean now that we can look forward in a much more optimistic fashion about how we support cultural and other very important parts of our state and how they function. So I think now is the time, and I particularly think I think we should all acknowledge that there seems not to be real disagreement here between what the ambition of the petition is, what RTE are saying, and indeed what we're hearing from government as well. And I suppose I just have two little questions around that. First of all, it seems from what you're saying, and you just touched on it yourself there, Mr. Coveney, are there people who are not happy with the proposal that essentially that the Symphony Orchestra would move from RTE partnership, in the future and into the National Concert Hall? So I know you're speaking about maybe others in this instance, but where are specifically those challenges? And secondly, you mentioned, and I think you actually put the word full-time into what you spoke, but it's not in the text. I just want to ask, if I could, about the broader provision of orchestral music in the state. In Cork, for example, with the Cork Symphony Orchestra, the youth orchestra there. Do you feel you referenced that Ireland has the worst model? Is there, even for us today, that you could reference best practice of how orchestral music, I suppose, moves from young people starting to learn, with you mentioned your own daughter, through into the schools of music, the institutions, and then through the voluntary into what ultimately may be, I don't want to necessarily say that it's tiered, but you know what I mean. I mean, are there other models where there is a better progression that you could reference? And I suppose specifically within all of this, is there consideration for the other orchestras in the state, whether youth or adult, that don't come under currently the provision of RTE? Thanks, Sherlock.
Thank you, Dara. Who wants to take that?
I might do the first one, maybe Heydon and maybe Matthew on the second and third one. Just in terms of people's I mean, I can't speak for everyone. I mean, within RTE and within the cohort of musicians and orchestral management, I think it'd be reasonable to say there's mixed views on what's being proposed. I think there's pretty strong agreement that the status quo, though, isn't tenable. I think there is a cohort of people who would rather remain in RTE. I think there is a cohort of people who can't wait to get out of RTE. And I think there is probably the majority who are optimistic about what's in front but want to see it done properly. So I think it's a mix. Outside of, I mean, Matthew might be able to give a view on this because he spoke to an awful lot of stakeholders outside of RTE to give a sense of what their views are. But as I said, I think it's mixed, would be reasonable to say. I think most people who want this are optimistic if it's delivered as looks like it might be, or hopefully will be. So.
Yeah, and the future for the orchestras, you referenced the other orchestras in Ireland, like the Cork Symphony Orchestra, there's the Irish Chamber Orchestra, the Irish Baroque Orchestra. There are quite a few orchestras around Ireland, but none of them are full-time, none of them are fully employed. RTE's orchestras are the only two that are full-time orchestras. And yes, it is an ambition of a lot of musicians to get into the orchestras around. Cork Symphony Orchestra is really very strong at the moment. There's an orchestra in UL in Limerick, and it's actually turning away people at the moment, who are trying to get into it. So, but these are not full-time professional musicians. These are people who want to play music, who have had some sort of the education that you referred to in their background, but still want to play music and may not want a full-time professional role. The only full-time professional roles in the country at the moment are RTE's orchestras.
And just a quick thing on the role of non-full-time, say, in Ireland. There is a vibrant and extensive provision of music and classical music, lots and lots of music that's traditional music, traditional Irish music. 80% of the orchestral music market, if you will, in other words, the amount of money that's generated and or spent, is RTE, whether the license fee or RTE's commercial income from commercializing elements of the orchestras. That's 80%, so 80 cents in the euro is RTE. There's quite a good breakdown on page 4 of your pack, but we do point out that in addition to that, there is a little bit of Arts Council funding, as you'll know, going into some of the other groups, some non-RTE commercial income, but only 5% or so of the total market, and some other small public grants. But it's a very imbalanced market when so much rests on just the single provider, RTE, and that was the main, I think, observation in our market sizing analysis that we started with in this process. Stakeholders we talked to outside of RTE, many of them, of course, have been around long enough to have remembered the piano report some years ago, which recommended that the National Symphony Orchestra be set up as an independent orchestra outside of RTE. We were mindful of previous reports when we were doing our own, but we were very much responding to the current set of dynamics. We weren't going back just to parrot older reports. But it is interesting that from our perspective across the stakeholders, we did hear over and over again that we need two orchestras because they are the only two professional ones, the magnets, if you will, for the sector. And to safeguard them, we think the National Symphony Orchestra should be a National Symphony Orchestra, truly independent, and set up as a separate entity. So we heard that pretty much across the piece. There were different points of view, of course, and differences of opinion, but most people signed up, I think, to that idea. Many, though, would wish to reserve judgment and see the detail, which is, I think, what this whole now process is about.
Is that okay, Dara? You're happy enough with that, okay? Jerry, you signalled.
In welcoming the presentation today, can I just say that, like Deputy Cassells and Deputy Murphy, we value greatly the RTE orchestras, and I think it's important when you travel. And I had the pleasure of being in Philadelphia during the summer, where I visited the Kimmel Centre. And a friend of mine, John Cohen, is a cellist with the Philadelphia Youth Orchestra, and there's a perennial funding issue across the world. Just in terms of the funding model, and I know that RTE in their 5-year plan were committed to the ongoing vibrancy and long-term view of the orchestra. In terms of the issue of the funding, Is it the case that already we're paying through the licence fee for the orchestra? And I know, Heydon, you in your presentation spoke about looking, and I know your DG has asked for extra money for the licence fee. But is it always the case that we're going back to the same solution, increase the licence fee? And Pat Rabbitte, when he was minister, had a preferential model for changing that. But in the 4 million it costs, RTE, and I might be wrong on this, you have a statutory obligation to maintain the orchestra. Would that be correct? Yeah. So in terms of the 4 million, I already know. So government give X, RTE gives Y, and the Z part, in terms of, is there any, model around rebranding in terms of funding from commercial activity, naming rights? I'm just asking the question, and I know you probably have discussed that at nausea, and I apologise if I should know that. I think there's widespread support for both of the orchestras we retain. I should actually kind of thank Sarah Joyce, who's in our gallery today, for the petition as part of Dublin Youth Orchestra. The taxpayer will always be of the view, show me the money, and what does it cost me? And I think, we need to recognise the value of and to put money forward. But the Minister yesterday got a 13.5% increase in the arts budget. The Creative Ireland Fund announced earlier this year, is there scope from within that to receive monies? And finally, in the overarching comment, is that I think all of us are conscious of the need for reform and for change, but if the orchestras are placed under the jurisdiction of the National Concert Hall, and the board review makes reference to that, how will it be ensured that there will be growth of the orchestras prioritised, given that there's been attrition of musicians, and I think we need to give them certainty and we need to give them priority. So my question is, in terms of the National Concert Hall, how will it be ensured that the growth of the orchestra is prioritised, even if that means there could be a potential financial loss for the NCH? But thank you for being here and for your presence in Gramaga Kerrick.
Thank you. Who wants to take that?
The licence fee, maybe first, because you're right to say it's the perennial answer seems to be to raise the licence fee, which I think frustrates some people. Our primary position on the licence fee for some time now has been it's losing 60 million a year because it's not being collected properly.
With the lowest rate of collection,
yeah, so it's very both expensive to collect by international standards and is very poorly collected in terms of the number of people who evade it and indeed avoid it, which is a slightly different issue. So as a system, is in dire need of reform. That's before you even consider raising the burden on households, raising it from 160. If the licence fee was being collected optimally, even at European averages, would we be here having this discussion? I don't know. I think the issues, we may be and we may not be, but certainly the financial position of RTE, we've had deficits for 7 of the last 9 years. We have, as I said, made enormous cutbacks across areas of our output. I mean, just to quickly go through them, factual programming and television, our investment is reduced by 38%.
Just, if I may, because I'm conscious of time constraints, we might just stick to the petition.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine.
I'm not disagreeing with you, but I think it's important in the overarching discussion to understand that it may have an implication for what we're discussing, but I take your point. I'll give it to you.
Just briefly to say, I mean, I said the orchestras sits within a set of obligations that RTE has. We have a lot of obligations, whether it's in news, whether it's in drama, whether it's in comedy, whether it's in children's programming, whether it's in radio services, etc., Irish language services. We're constantly juggling these responsibilities to give the optimum we can to the audience as best we can. So it's in that context, I guess, you have to consider the orchestras. If you were thinking about them on their own, you could have one view. If you think about the overall responsibility and the diminishing funding envelope, yeah, I think it's a slightly different perspective. In relation to the model that's being proposed, it isn't about the licence fee. In fact, it's about a third source of income, i.e. direct exchequer grant of some kind, being channeled to support the NSO under new governance arrangements within the hall. And you're right to point out about the concerns about the independence of the NSO within the hall, about its financial independence, should another downturn come, in terms of the all these issues are issues we share, which will form part of the discussions with both the department and the NCH over the next year as we try and chart a future. So.
Do you want to add to that?
No, I would just like to say thanks to Sarah for the work that she put in doing the petition and getting all of the signatories that she managed to get for the petition, because it just shows, it shows everybody how passionate people are about our orchestral output and about the future of our orchestral output.
It'd be great if you get them to come to the hall, actually.
Okay, are you okay with that, Jerry? Okay, I'm going to move on. Eugene?
Chairman, I'm going to keep it very brief now, because a lot of what I wanted to say or ask has been done, but you're most welcome here today. And I suppose going back to the petition coming in, I think that was very important, because I think it's actually opened up a new debate on the orchestras. And I was just thinking there of all the fantastic performance with the orchestras, whether it's on the Late Late Show, whether it's with Daniel O'Donnell or Mike Denver or some of the pop stars. I mean, there has been amazing shows done. I can't think of the guy from Bulgaria, you did one recently with him, it was fantastic. I would say that right throughout the country, there is huge, I won't say recognition, I think there's an issue of recognition, but acknowledgement of the good thing this is. So hopefully from what's happening here, we will have further recognition of the orchestras, because I'm just looking at a piece of material about us here, enhancing life through music's extraordinary capacity to communicate, motivate, uplift, educate and entertain is at the heart of the RT Concert Orchestra. And from my own 20 years involved in media, producing and presenting and doing a lot of music at times, I can really appreciate that. So just one or two very brief questions. One is, how many full-time musicians have you? I don't know whether that was clarified yet or not. Number two, obviously financial constraints maybe in recent years are an issue, but I think if you had a sponsor, and I don't know whether you can get a sponsor, I'm just asking, can you get a sponsor? But if you had a substantial sponsor, can you get out more into the country? I think this type of music would be a hit in every county. Now, obviously you can't be on the road every week of the year, but I think it's a significant area of creating more finance and actually getting better known. Because everybody will talk about the orchestra when they see them on the Late Late Show, or the Ray Darcy Show, or some other show, or in concert with somebody. But I think it goes out of people's mind then. So it's fantastic what you do, absolutely amazing people. So it could be very positive if you had the right financial backing. So there are the one or two things that I would like clarified. Thank you.
Heydon.
Can I just say, both the models that you reference between sponsorship and actually getting people to back us in whatever way possible are looked at constantly, absolutely, without a doubt. You know, we're always looking for new ways of actually bringing in revenue for both orchestras. But the reality is that the big companies are not out there anymore. They're not sponsoring arts in particular, but they're certainly not sponsoring orchestral output. And, you know, it's getting more and more difficult to get anybody who's actually interested in that type of sponsorship. But that's a global issue. That's not just here in Ireland. You asked about the size of the orchestras. The National Symphony Orchestra was 81 players. It's now 68 players. The RT Concert Orchestra was 45 players. It's now 40 players. And we have started recruitment. We have started to fill some key roles, but to get back to where we were and to go beyond it, which the report recommends, to actually expand the orchestras back up to 89 players with the Symphony Orchestra, that requires funding. And this is the big battle.
Can I just briefly add to that, just on the issue of sponsorship and commercial support? I think all of that's related to a clear future as well. You know, I think if you have an orchestra which is fully staffed, is touring routinely, is attempting more and more ambitious programming, that starts to become much more attractive for a sponsor as well. There's a kind of a virtuous circle here. If you get a baseline level of funding that enables you to do very exciting things with two orchestras, other commercial opportunities open up, and we've seen some of that in the concert orchestra in the last couple of years with I'm not sure if any of you have been to the Jenny Green gigs around the country, but in the Marquee in Cork now it's been there 4 times. That's due to go back again, which is a 1990s dance retrospective with an orchestra, which is, it's having an enormous reaction. It's a very different, it's not classical music per se, but it's a very popular use of a concert orchestra, and an example of what's possible when you have a kind of a clear creative vision. So,
could I just say one thing about cost that is important and inescapable is it's very expensive to run an orchestra, and it's very expensive to take an orchestra on the road. So if you look at the period we looked at, 2007 to 2016, the number of regional performances outside of Dublin by the NSO were 11 in 2007 and just 3 in 2016. Educational performances 20 in 2007, just 13 in 2016. That was because the constant need to find cuts. The most easiest thing to do is to stop traveling and stay in one place. Wasn't the best outcome culturally or artistically, but it was a necessity financially. So we felt, at that final point, we felt the Bowden Review, and Helen Bowden and Media Team felt very strongly that it was incumbent upon us to consider how to get to the point of funding certainty and to be realistic in what we said. So we realistically thought about the commercial revenues that were possible. We did put into our sort of modelling, as you were worked on by my colleague George Smith behind me, worked through what the commercial revenues might be, and in our assumptions, they are higher than they've been. So we do assume that with a better functioning, more excitement about the two fully staffed orchestras could make more money, but there's a limit to that. So that's how we focused on that amount that was the gap, the XYZ calculation, X from broadcast fees from RTE, Y from the commercial world, Z from the gap, which would be a direct grant of some kind. And we felt we had to do it properly because no country, even the most laissez-faire country, no country runs an orchestral classical music service or segment without public money.
Indeed. Are you okay? So, Eugene, are you happy enough? Okay, so, Martin.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, everybody for coming in today, and it's great to have, and the petitioner for us to be able to have this discussion. And I think it is very helpful. And there is widespread support for the two orchestras. Maybe at times it's something we take for granted, but it's definitely not something anybody wants to see gone. And I'm very struck by the part in the report where it says the demographics of the listenerships. Obviously, the hardest group to reach are younger people. Well, you go to Electric Picnic, you're going to reach the younger people, and that's been hugely positive, really, really positive, and just shows you the orchestra has been willing to kind of looking to actively make that reach out to a new audience in new ways. So, in all of that, my starting point here is a hugely positive one. Most of the questions have been touched on, so I'm not going to rehash those. I was going to ask the question, how much does it actually cost for the orchestras? Because between the report and the other bit, I didn't actually have that information. I've heard the figure 4 million kind of mentioned around now as to what will come in terms of the minister adding, but is that the shortfall or the actual cost of running? If you could actually answer that bit first, and then I'll follow on maybe.
Yeah, well, it's to be decided. It's the short answer. The balance of payments between the various parties has been agreed.
But the actual, sorry, Chair, the actual overall cost of running the orchestra.
The fully loaded cost of the two orchestras in 2017 is about, I think it's just over 16 million.
16 million. Okay.
Right.
So
we just checked that.
And I think, have I heard a figure of 4 million mentioned as something that the Arts Council or the Department of Culture might be talking about putting in?
Was just on the modelling we did around the report, and again, this is based on historics.
It's like 15.5.
Yeah. So we looked at what it would cost to run the two orchestras at returning to their historical levels of staffing and touring and education, which we thought was an important litmus test. And we then calculated what a performance fee or a broadcast fee would be. Again, our numbers, I think, were published. I'm allowed to say that. 3.5 million would be the fee from RTE. The gap for that fully costed model was just over 4 million. And it was that 4 million that we had identified as being a requirement for there to be direct public money backstop. ongoing. And then we did point out that if there are better outcomes commercially, which I think, I'm not suggesting that things become overly commercial, they have to be driven by the creative vision of the orchestras and the audience, but if there were outperformance, then things could flex a bit and change over time, and there would be a benefit to all the funding parties, ultimately to the best interest of the music lover and someone going to a concert or listening on the radio. So we didn't sort of try and carve those into stone, those numbers, but they were a pretty good reflection, we thought. As we said, it was incumbent upon us to be logical and rational about it, but we thought that was around the order of magnitude that made sense in terms of the funding parties. So that's where that 4 million comes from.
Thanks, Alan. So, sorry, Chair, if I could just finish the last couple of points I was to make. There was suggestions in another committee here by a different politician that maybe RT were using the orchestras to make a broader financial case. Personally, I don't think that's borne out by fact when you look at the fact that you've outlined in your opening address that 24% cuts to RT and only 11% cut to the orchestras. It shows they've been relatively well insulated. But just to give you an opportunity maybe to come back against that point that was put on the record in another committee in this House. And also to say that if RTE had its choice, and let's say 4 million roughly was the figure that a State Department was going to put in or the Arts Council was going to put in to make up the shortfall, would RTE prefer just to get that 4 million rather than seeing the new entity be created? And if that had been the case, could you have guaranteed that the 4 million would be spent on the orchestras as opposed to getting consumed? Because I'm sure if you got an extra 4 million, there'd be an awful lot of hands out looking for in all different directions within the organisation.
I mean, the last question about I think the decision around the governance arrangements of the future of the NSO, it really wasn't one for RT to make on its own. So when you're talking about a mixed funding model where there's a direct exchequer grant, plus commercial income, plus a proportion of RT's public funding supporting it, it did prompt the question about where that entity, newly funded entity should be and should sit, and the review had two options. Ultimately, that was a choice for government to either accept or not. I mean, the alternative is just to fund RT properly. You could argue, just fix the licence fee collection system, and some of these issues might go away. I mean, in fairness, I think to Matthew, maybe he might want to comment on it. I mean, the report does actually deal with some of the more creative issues around the future vision and of what the orchestra should do, and is it optimal in any event, notwithstanding the financial position, that both orchestras should be within one organisation. I mean, I think there's pros and cons for both of those views, but I think this isn't purely a financial decision. In relation to the issue of RT using the orchestral story as a way of highlighting its financial woes, I just don't think it bears out. I mean, I think the review substantively dealt with the future of orchestras in great detail. We were at a crossroads. Frankly, the status quo around orchestras isn't sustainable, isn't tenable. We're obliged to do something, to quote the petition again. And that something is now a roadmap. I think does it highlight some of the broader issues that relate to RT's funding and in relation to some of the cutbacks it's had to make over the last 10 years? Maybe, but that's unavoidable considering the scale of change that we've had to make over the last number of years.
And I should just say that RT are not walking away from either orchestra here. We will still be very much involved with the National Symphony Orchestra. We would still be very much involved with the concert orchestras. So it's not a case of RT doing this review to walk away from something. It's about the future of both orchestras.
Okay, so I just have a few questions myself, if I may. Can I just ask in very practical terms, the oversight and working group, how does that work? What are the modalities of that group, if you will? Does that meet on a regular basis? And where's the end state to that? I mean, what is the timeline for the completion of that work?
I don't know, is the short answer. There is a draft terms of reference, which it hasn't been concluded yet. We haven't met formally yet, either group. There's been initial discussions with the Department of Culture. So I can't answer you right now. We're hopeful, I mean, the broad gap between the two, I think the oversight group will largely deal with governance issues, funding, and any necessary legislative changes that need to happen to enable the safe landing of the NSO within the remit of the National Concert Hall. and the working group will deal with perhaps some of the more practical issues around the transfer of undertakings process between and the management of staff from one institution to another. But as I said, the final terms of reference haven't been agreed yet, nor timings for that matter.
Okay, so we're in, you could argue then, and I don't wish to put words in anybody's mouth, but just to have a viewpoint from you, it's still a little bit nebulous, I mean, the process. I mean, we have the recommendations. The recommendations are very clear. There seems to have been political a welcoming, if you will, or the mood music, forgive the pun, has been quite positive politically from Minister Madigan and Minister Naughton. I mean, if their statements on the 5th of July and the 28th of April are to go by, there seems to be a clear sense of wanting to engage and wanting to work through to a solution. I think we still, if I'm interpreting you correctly, we still have a little bit of a gap here in terms of how the oversight group works and what the timelines are. And it would be very useful for us, I think, if I was concluding proceedings here today, not to close any petition pending further information, if you will, in relation to the actual process, and to seek more definitive timelines in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'd be in a very different place today if there had been no reaction from the state, or indeed if there had been a hostile one or a or you're on your own lads type response.
Okay.
So, I mean, we're taking the, I think rightly, the ministers on their word. They've, I said the cabinet considered this formally, the government considered it formally, the review, have accepted it in principle and have made a specific decision around the future home. The details of the funding, the details of how it happens and when it happens and everything else are to happen. I think I'd like to believe we're in a good place, but like you, we would share your concerns. This is by no means a done deal, and there's a gap between lip and cup, as they say.
Indeed.
And we want to get this. We very much want to get up and running with the details.
Okay. Can I just say, just in terms of the point that Heydon made earlier on in relation to the stream, if you will, or the river from the stream and Cooley and Bellavorna and places like that, where Mishaera right up to Jenny Green, and I think if you're talking about cultural output and if you're talking about the value which is very difficult to put a kind of a monetary value on something which is so deeply embedded and so cultural and so ingrained in the Irish psyche, but there's a clear thread, I believe, between Mishaera and Jenny Green and people bopping about at the electric picnic. There is that thread, and the tie that binds there are the orchestras, in effect. And I would just make a point of, to say that I don't think we should lose sight of that, and I think it is important then that we, as individual members of this Oireachtas, ensure that we can find some mechanism to support the continuation in every way that we can. So I think I could reasonably speak for my fellow members here when I say that I think it is for us to maybe give further consideration to what you have brought to us here today. I believe that it has been a very valuable contribution to our understanding, and I know there have been other mechanisms through which you can do that in this House, but the Petitions Committee, it's the one mechanism that we have where the citizen engages with us, and when the citizen engages with us and raises this important issue and garners so many signatures, then I think it's incumbent on us to ensure that we take maybe some messages that you've delivered here today and feed them back into the political landscape, because I think there is a tremendous goodwill. And I, for one, personally, I mean, the campaign around Love Your Orchestras, that's resonating. That is having a deep resonance, I think, with anybody who has an appreciation of the cultural output of RT, if you will. So could I just thank you for your contributions here today. They have been very valuable. I think we will give this further consideration now. We are definitely more educated by virtue of our deliberations here with you today. And I think there's perhaps further questions in relation to the actual process, I think, which this committee must give further consideration to. I think everybody has welcomed largely the report. The report is very digestible, you know, and easily understood. I think we just need to maybe interrogate further the workings of the Oversight and Working Group, and maybe have a further discussion on that. So could I, please?
Just on that, obviously we're a key stakeholder in this process with Fernie, but there are others, and it may be worth thinking about
Indeed.
The role of the Hall and indeed the Department. The Department have been mandated by Cabinet to chair the transition process effectively through groups and chair both groups themselves. So it may be at some point useful to talk to them, for you to talk to them, but that's
yes, no, and I appreciate that. And what just
to be part
in
of
terms
that,
of the, I suppose, the mechanics of this, now we will give further consideration to this, you know, at our next meeting, and then if we need to invite more people in, more witnesses or stakeholders in, you know, we're free to do that. But I think this is an important first cut, and we wanted to give this particular petition a public airing because of the importance of the subject matter. So I think today has been a very positive first step in that sense. So it's my duty now to just maybe finish out the proceedings of that. Again, to thank you for your appearance here, and we're going to adjourn the meeting until Wednesday the 24th at 1:30 p.m. So the meeting now stands adjourned. Thank you.